Now, the Apostle Paul, who came along and wrote about 25 or 30 years after Jesus' resurrection, he takes the teachings of Jesus, contextualizes them. For those of us who aren't Jewish, he wrote to primarily a Gentile audience. He writes to some Christians in Rome, and he kind of teases this idea out just a bit. And listen to how he says basically what we've said kind of in his New Testament way. Here's what Paul wrote. He said this, and I love this. Paul did this all the time. Don't you know? He would always start off, don't you know? Now, this was his way of saying, really? Really? Like, do I really even have to say this? I mean, don't you know? In other words, this means, doesn't everybody know? Doesn't everybody already know this? Isn't this so obvious that when I say it, everybody's going to shake their head? Don't you know? And what he's about to say is something you already know. He's just going to say it in a way you haven't heard before. He's about to sort of point us in the direction of some common sense that he's hoping will surface in the minds of his readers in such a way that they'll take hold of it and do something with it. So here's what he says. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone or something, that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey? When you read that, you go, I don't even know what he's talking about. No, I didn't know that, because I don't even know what does that even mean? Let me read it again. Don't you know, now think about this. Don't think about theology, don't think about Bible, just think common sense. Don't you know that when you offer yourself, I'll take one of those. I'll do that. Yes, 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 yes. Don't you know when you offer yourself to someone or something as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey? In other words, he says, if you continue to say yes to a pleasure over and over and over, don't you realize that you are becoming a slave to that pleasure? You go, I'm not a slave, I'm choosing. And he's going, see, that's my point. Don't you know that if you choose the same thing over and over and over, you're no longer choosing. You're being drawn in. You are giving up control. You are behaving like a slave. You're behaving as if you have to, not simply that you want to. And then he goes on. He says, whether you are slaves to sin, every time sin comes calling, you answer the door, come on in, come on in. Whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, and we've talked about this a few weeks ago, sin always leads to death. Old Testament sin, New Testament sin, your definition of sin. All sin leads to death. Sin always kills stuff. It kills the way you view yourself. It kills your marriage. It kills your relationship with your kids. It kills your relationship with your employees, your employers. Sin always kills stuff. Wherever there is sin, something is dying. He says, so either you offer yourself as slaves to sin, which leads to death, or there's an alternative. And now he's leaning into what Jesus said. He said, or you offer yourself to obedience to God through Christ, which leads to righteousness. And righteousness is just a fancy New Testament word that means to have a right relationship or right standing with God. And Paul says, look, don't you realize that every single day of your life, you are offering yourself as a servant to or a slave to. You are offering yourself through obedience to either sin, or in our case, we're going to use the term pleasure, and not all pleasure is sin. Most pleasure is not a sin, but you're offering yourself to something or someone. He says, when you do that, when you obey, when you say yes over and over and over, you are giving up your freedom and you are acting like a servant or a slave. He said, and you can either do that to pleasure, you can do that to sin, or you can lean into and offer yourself up as a servant or slave to your heavenly Father. Jesus' way of saying it is, you can follow me because I'm a good shepherd. And Paul would say, as we saw a few weeks ago, and when you say yes to God, you have, remember this, peace with God, which paves the way to peace with ourselves, which equips us to make peace with others. He says, when you decide to follow Jesus as the good shepherd, when you decide to opt for obedience to God is going to pave the way to have peace with ourselves. I'm good with me. And often and eventually it equips you to make peace with others. And my friends, we've discussed this. This is happiness. Every happy person you know is at peace with themselves. Every happy person you know has figured out how to make peace with people, and even people that don't want to be at peace with them. And most happy people that you know have somehow found peace with God. And Paul says, don't you know Don't you know that when you continually, anything that you say yes to, anybody that you say yes to over and over and over, don't you realize you're becoming a servant to that person or that thing? So if you say yes to any pleasure over and over and over and over, you have become a servant to, a slave to that pleasure. And when pleasure takes precedence over the principles of happiness, ultimately you have neither pleasure nor happiness. Jesus' way of saying it is simply this, remember? If you sow better, you'll reap better, and then you'll feel better. If you sow better, you'll reap better, and ultimately you'll feel better. And here's why this is so important, because here's where we get in trouble. We get in trouble when we're unhappy, and when we're feeling unhappy, we immediately want to do something that makes us feel better. Isn't that how we get in trouble? I'm unhappy, so I'm going to go shopping. I'm going to go happy, so I'm going to stop by the wherever. I'm unhappy, so I'm going to call so-and-so because I know they have some. I'm unhappy, and I'm going to, call her. I'm unhappy. I need something to kind of pick me up. I need a quick fix. That's when we make decisions that ultimately undermine our own happiness. And here's Jesus' message to all of you who are unhappy. He says there is no quick fix to happiness. You sow and you reap your way there. Happiness is not immediately accessible. But as long as you are saying yes to pleasure over and over and over to somehow be a quick fix for your lack of happiness, ultimately you undermine your own happiness because you become a slave, a servant to the one to whom you give obedience. And so Jesus says, sow better, reap better. And ultimately, not immediately, not this afternoon, not tomorrow by 5, but ultimately you will feel better. But if your response to unhappiness is, I've got to do something right now to feel better, ultimately you're undermining your own happiness. And you already know that, don't you? Because every single one of us in this room, including me, we know we know the thing we reach for to give us that quick fix when we're not feeling happy. And every time you obey that inclination, Paul says, you are acting like a slave or a servant to something that ultimately undermines your own happiness. This is why you hear us say from time to time that following Jesus will make your life better. And following Jesus will make you better at life. That following Jesus who says, I'm the good shepherd, you can trust me, follow me. Following Jesus will make your life better, and ultimately, following Jesus will make you better at life. But it's not instant. It's not a quick fix. It's sowing and sowing and sowing and sowing and ultimately reaping. So, I've got to ask you kind of a tough probing question, okay? And when I ask you this question, here's what I want you to do. Okay, don't argue, okay? I'm going to ask you a question, but nobody can read your mind. So there's no point in not admitting to yourself. I'm not going to, and this isn't a trick. It's not like, and if you answered the question this way, I need you to raise your hand. Now I need you to stand up. Now, and we're not going to do that, okay? I just want you, no matter what you're religious, you're not religious at all, or you may be like me, where you're basically born in the church, you've been in church your whole life. Here's the thing. I just want you to answer this question for you because you owe it to yourself to know, and as we're going to discover, you owe it to the people who love you to know the answer to this question and to admit this to yourself. Because remember, only a thief will try to steal your future from you. Only a thief will try to kill your relationships, and only a thief would try to destroy you. So why not acknowledge what's true about you today? Only a thief would not want you to answer this question. Okay, so you ready? Here's the question. Is there a pleasure that's undermining your happiness? Is there a pleasure, not a sin, maybe a sin, may not be. Is there a pleasure? It's not immoral, it's not illegal, although it may be immoral and it may be illegal, or it may sort of be illegal, but nobody cares. Is there a sin that is beginning, is there a pleasure rather, that is beginning to undermine your happiness? In other words, if you're real honest and you don't want to admit it, I know you don't want to admit it because if you admit it, then you have to do something about it. No, you don't. You don't have to do anything. I just want you to be honest with yourself. Is there a pleasure that you have said yes to so many times, it is beginning to undermine your happiness? Is there a pleasure that if you continue to say yes to it, it's going to undermine the happiness of the people that you care about the most? Is there a pleasure, and every once in a while your daughter says, Mom, why do you always? Daddy, why do you? And you're like, go over there and sit down, you'll understand when you're older. Is there a pleasure that is slow? Now, your girlfriend kind of looks at you every time, and you can tell she wants to say something, but she knows better than to say something because last time she said something. Your wife wants to say something, your husband, is there a pleasure? Come on, it's just you. It's just you and you. Is there a pleasure that has begun to undermine your happiness? If you continue to say yes to that pleasure, you're a thief. You are in opposition to Jesus' invitation to follow him as the good shepherd. Let me ask it a different way, as if that wasn't clear enough. Is there a pleasure that's slowly taking you prisoner? Is there a pleasure? It may be illegal, maybe legal, maybe moral, maybe some people don't know. It doesn't matter. Is there a pleasure that is slowly taking you prisoner? You are slowly losing your freedom to say no. Not only do you answer the door every time the doorbell rings, you find yourself staring out the window hoping it's going to show up soon. Is there a pleasure that is slowly taking you prisoner? That without meaning to, you have prioritized the pursuit of pleasure over your pursuit of happiness? You know the answer to that question. And you don't have to answer it for anybody but yourself. But here's what I want you to know, as if you need me to tell you. One day, you'll wish you would quit answering the door. One day, you'll look back and wonder why you're so unhappy. And you'll discover in that moment, as many of you are discovering right now, that you have become your own worst enemy. That you are, in fact, a sheep who needs a shepherd. And perhaps by God's grace today, you would be willing to trade your pleasure for a shepherd. That you would be willing to trade your pleasure for a good shepherd who's not going to drain you of life, but a good shepherd who has come into this world to promise you and to give you life. And that is an exchange you will never, ever, ever regret. Because Jesus said, I am the good shepherd, and I am so good, I was willing to lay down my life for my sheep so that they might have life and have it to the full.